hold this year's Jonathan and Maxine Marshall Distinguished Lecture during our inaugural Humanities Week, a robust series of gatherings that well illustrate the kind of humanities we value here, with a world-class faculty who collaborate with our students to create a more just and humane world. The Marshall Distinguished Lecture gifts our community with access to some of the most important writers and thinkers of our time. We are grateful to the Marshall family for the endowment that has made this yearly event possible. We urge any of you in the audience today inspired by this event to likewise think of ASU Humanities. Now, it's my pleasure tonight to welcome two brilliant minds to our community, Ruben Espinosa and Clint Smith. My second copy of Dr. Smith's How the World is Past arrived in my office over the summer. It came with a note from President Michael Crow that stated, "A great book by an emerging writer." Actually, it does say that. I have to say, I love having a university president who sends me books. There's almost a week that doesn't go by where something has arrived. And I didn't have the heart to tell President Crow that I'd already read this book a long time ago, and that Clint is not an emerging writer, that in fact he's been blazing a trail that many of us have been following with deep interest for a long time. But it somehow seemed right to be able to bring President Crow's copy with me this evening. A poet and an incisive writer, Smith is someone whose work I've been following for a while. His emotion-laden turns of phrase and ability to pack a world into a vignette never cease to stun me. You'll see that my copy of his book is dog-eared from passages that I return to often. Here, for example, is a favorite. And often when I introduce a writer that I greatly admire, just like to read one very short quotation from them that stays with me. This one is about an encounter at a Confederate cemetery, where a descendant of someone buried there insists that he must hold on to the glory that never was, because otherwise his ancestors become monsters. This is how the chapter ends. It's on Blandford Cemetery. But as I think of Blandford, I'm left wondering if we are all just patchworks of the stories we've been told. What would it take? What does it take for you to confront a false history, even if it means shattering the stories you've been told throughout your life? Even if it means having to fundamentally re-examine who you are and who your family has been. Just because something is difficult to accept doesn't mean you should refuse to accept it. Just because someone tells you a story doesn't make that story true. And there are moments like that where I just close a book and go, damn. It says it all and says it so well. Just because someone tells you a story doesn't make that story true. That's the humanities at work, the embodiment of what the Marshall Lecture aims to bring to wide publics. Finally, I want to share with you a story that is 100% true. Ruben Espinosa is an associate professor of English and associate director of the Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies here at ASU. He joined us this summer and is one of the best hires we have ever made. A scholar of Shakespeare and the Southwest borderlands and contemporary problems at once, Dr. Espinosa's ability to make clear that the stakes of studying the past are the creation of a more humane future are evident throughout his copious work. He is the author or editor of 3 books and numerous journal articles. His monograph in progress is entitled Shakespeare on the Border, Language, Legitimacy, and La Frontera. It is a pleasure to turn the evening over to him now. Please join me in welcoming Professor Espinosa.
So thank you, Dean Cohen. I also want to echo you in expressing my gratitude to the Marshall family who made this event possible. And I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. Now, I have the distinct honor of introducing tonight's distinguished speaker. In Clint Smith's stunning poem, Playground Elegy, from his award-winning book of poetry, Counting Descent, the speaker relates the exhilaration of coming down a playground slide with arms raised the way his mother teaches him to do. He describes that sensation as something synonymous with feeling alive. However, the speaker goes on to say, when I read of the new child, his body strewn across the street, a casket of bones and concrete, I wonder how many times he slid down the slide, how many times he defied gravity to answer a question in class. Did he raise his hands for all of them? Does my mother regret this? That she raised a black boy growing up to think that raised hands made me feel more alive. That raised hands meant I was alive. That raised hands meant I would live. I highlight this particular moment in this particular poem because it illustrates Smith's keen ability to make evident for his audience precisely what is at stake when the long, racist, violent history of our nation is brought into focus. In this poem, the happiness of black boyhood and the inevitable loss of such happiness coexist. They are marked by the same physical act. The ability to underscore the simultaneity of strength and precarity behind such things as joy, family, self-confidence, and belonging is his gift. Be it in his two brilliant poems in the 1619 Project, his TED Talks, his Black American History crash course on YouTube, his contributions to The Atlantic, or his New York Times best-selling book, How the Word is Passed, Smith so often allows us insight to that space where, to quote James Baldwin, the private streets and the public streets meet. This is his gift, and we as readers are fortunate to have his voice in our world. He's an award-winning poet, an author, the recipient of several prestigious fellowships, a poetry slam champion, a scholar, an educator, and an unbelievable performer. Tonight, we are fortunate enough to have him read from his work and join us in conversation. So please join me in giving a warm ASU welcome to Clint Smith.
So wonderful to be here with you all tonight. This is officially now my first in-person event in about 20 months. So I was joking before. I was saying this is also the first event in 20 months that I have done not in my slippers. So I should have made clear that this would have been slipper night, so that we could have all been in our element. It is a real joy and pleasure to be here with you all. It's the first time that my book came out in June, and all of my talks have been virtual, all my events have been virtual, and while that is helpful in the context of having a 4-year-old and 2-year-old that I can put to bed, it is also nice to not have to put them to bed and to spend this evening with you all. So I know we have a relatively brief time, and you all have busy lives, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about the origin story of the book, and then read from a poem that actually gave birth to the Narrative Nonfiction Project itself. So the book began in 2017, in May of 2017, as I was watching several Confederate statues come down in my hometown in New Orleans, statues to P.G.T. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee. And I was watching these statues come down and thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. And what are the implications of that? What does it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Parkway? That my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy? That my parents still live on a street today named after someone who owned over 150 enslaved people? Because we know that symbols and names and iconography aren't just symbols. They are reflective of the stories that people tell. And those stories shape the narratives that communities carry, and those narratives shape public policy, and public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives. And that's not to say that taking down a 60-foot tall statue of Robert E. Lee or making Juneteenth a federal holiday is suddenly going to erase the racial wealth gap, but it is to say that all of these things are part of an ecosystem of ideas and stories and narratives that help us understand what has happened throughout the history of this country, and then gives us the tools with which to more fully understand how to make amends for the harm that has been done to different communities and different demographics of people across generations. And so I was thinking about these questions and thinking about how my own hometown in New Orleans, a place where the historian Walter Johnson says of New Orleans, the whole city is a memorial to slavery, a place where enslaved labor built the levees, built the roads, built the buildings, built the infrastructure that made New Orleans at one point the largest slave port in the country, one of the largest slave markets in the country, and thinking about how was my own hometown telling the story or failing to tell the story of itself. And then I sort of got interested in how different places across the country were telling the story or failing to tell the story of itself. And one of the places that I start this book is Monticello Plantation. And Monticello, many folks know, is the home of Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, one of our founding fathers. And Jefferson, I think, is really interesting because he sort of personifies the cognitive dissonance of this country, in the sense that America is a place that has provided unparalleled, unimaginable opportunities for millions of people across generations in ways that their ancestors could have never imagined. But it has also done so at the direct expense of millions and millions of other people who have been intergenerationally subjugated and oppressed. And both of those things are the story of this country. And it's not that one's over here and another's over here, it's that they are deeply entangled alongside one another. And I think similarly, Jefferson is someone who embodies that in the sense that he wrote one of the most important documents in the history of the Western world, and also enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime, including 4 of his own children that he had by an enslaved woman, Sally Hemings, who was his human property. That he wrote in one document that all men are created equal, and wrote in another document that black people are inferior to whites in both endowments of body and mind. Said the slave was incapable of love, incapable of possessing or sustaining complex emotion. Wrote about Phillis Wheatley, who was considered to be the first published black poet in the history of the United States. He's like, well, black people don't possess the emotional acuity or the psychological bandwidth with which to create beautiful art. He said that love is the ostrom of the poet, and black people don't have the emotional ability to transcend to that emotional state. They don't have the ability to experience love, and love is necessary in order to be a poet. So we can call this something else, but we shouldn't call it poetry, because black people don't know how to create, to reach the emotional state that is necessary to create art. And I think about that, and I think about how that's a version of Jefferson that I was never taught in school. And I think, again, how Jefferson is this microcosm of how so often we tell a story of American exceptionalism without wrestling with what makes us unexceptional, or what makes us unexceptional in a negative context rather than in a positive context. And so when I go to Monticello, part of what I'm thinking about is, well, how is this institution telling the story of itself and telling the story of Jefferson in a way that honors and takes seriously the nuances and complexities and contradictions that are embodied within his life? And not even beyond that, how does this place tell the story of the enslaved people who also made Monticello possible? The Hearnses, the Grangers, the Hemingses, the Fawcett's, the families who had built community here, who had their own families here, who cultivated this land, who built the buildings on this land, who in many ways this land belongs to more so than it belongs to Jefferson. Jefferson was away in DC, New York, Philadelphia, Paris for extended periods of time, and it is Jefferson, or is the enslaved families that Jefferson owned, rather, who were on that land across generations, across time, who created the memories and created the landscape that we come to know today. And so there's this one moment in the book where I had gone on this tour with one of the docents, a guy named David Thorson, and I talk about how in an hour he gave this masterclass of the contradictions embodied within Jefferson's writing and his intellectual practice and his life. And I was watching these two women named Donna and Grace, and their mouths sort of hung agape. You could see their face wilting as David talked about Jefferson separating families, of beating enslaved people, of separating children from their parents. And I went up to them after, and I asked Donna, I was like, well, what did you think about what you heard? How'd you experience that? And she was like, man, he really took the shine off the guy. I had no idea Jefferson owned slaves. I had no idea that Monticello was a plantation. And mind you, these are people who bought plane tickets, rented cars, got hotel rooms, came to this site as a sort of pilgrimage to see the home of the third president of the United States and one of our founding fathers, and had no idea that it was a plantation, had no idea that Jefferson was an enslaver. And so I'm interested in how has Monticello evolved in the way that it tells this story. And so many of the emails that I've gotten since the book has come out is from people who visited Monticello, which is arguably the most famous plantation, not even just in the world, but in the country, which has 500,000, or at least before the pandemic, had 500,000 visitors per year, who went to Monticello years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and are saying, nobody talked about this stuff when we went. And part of what it reflects, I think, is how public institutions and these public historical sites are recognizing that they have a unique responsibility in how we tell this story. 500,000 people visit Monticello every year. 500,000 people have not read my book. That'd be great if they did. But like 500,000 people don't read even the most popular book about slavery, right? So these places are in a unique position to have people who might not encounter this information in another context to serve as an entry point for them to think differently about the history of this country and to think more holistically about how they are situated within it. And I'll talk briefly about one other place before I read something briefly. Another place that I go afterwards is Angola Prison. Angola is the largest maximum security prison in the country. It is 18,000 acres wide, bigger than the island of Manhattan. It is a place where 75% of the people held there are black men. Over 70% of them are serving life sentences, and it is built on top of a former plantation. And what I tell folks is that if you were to go to Germany, and you had the largest maximum security prison in Germany, and it was built on top of a former concentration camp, in which the people held there were disproportionately Jewish, that place would rightfully be a global emblem of anti-Semitism. It would be abhorrent. It would be disgusting. We would never allow a place like that to exist because it would so clearly run counter to all of our moral and ethical sensibilities. And yet here in the United States, we have the largest maximum security prison in the country where the vast majority of people are black men serving life sentences who work for virtually no pay while someone watches over them on horseback with a gun over their shoulder on land that used to be a plantation. And so part of what I'm thinking about when I go to a place like Angola is what are the ways that a history of white supremacy not only enacts physical violence against people's bodies, but also collectively numbs us as a country to certain types of violence that in another global context would so clearly be unacceptable. And what does it mean not only that that place is not interested in the project of interrogating its relationship to this history, but also that it has a gift shop. And at this gift shop they sell coffee mugs and shot glasses and sweatshirts and t-shirts and stuffed animals dressed in prison garb, and that on some of these shot glasses, on some of these coffee mugs, it has the silhouette of a watchtower, and above and below the silhouette it says Angola, a gated community, right? As if to make a mockery of and to belittle the conditions of the thousands of people who are incarcerated there, right? And so visiting all of these places gives me such a distinct set of the heterogeneity and the sort of plurality with which slavery is remembered in this country. And at the end of it, part of what I want people to understand is our proximity to this history, that it wasn't that long ago, that the history we tell ourselves was, you know, in the Jurassic period, which is how I felt like I learned about slavery when I was a kid. It was like the Flintstones, the Brachiosauruses, and slavery, like they all existed at the same time. But the woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture alongside the Obama family in 2016, a woman named Ruth Bonner, was the daughter of an enslaved person. Not the granddaughter, not the great-granddaughter. The woman who opened the Smithsonian in 2016 was the daughter of someone born into chattel slavery. My grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. So when I think about my 4-year-old son sitting on my grandfather's lap, I imagine my grandfather sitting on his grandfather's lap. And I'm reminded again that this history we tell ourselves was a long time ago was not that long ago at all. And so the idea that we would suggest that it has nothing to do with what the contemporary landscape of inequality looks like is both morally and intellectually disingenuous. I'm going to read briefly from this and then look forward to being in conversation. But I was going to read from the book, but part of what I think is more interesting is to sort of talk about what led to the book's creation. So my first book, as was mentioned, was a collection of poetry. And at first I thought this would be a collection of poetry. I thought the conceit would be that each poem in the book would be about a different monument in New Orleans. And then as projects do, it changed and it evolved and it took on a life of its own, and I felt like it needed more space and more room and more voices besides myself. But poetry for me is often the creation of art, but also the mechanism through which I do my best thinking. Like I think through poems, because I think what poetry does best for me is it teaches me to pay attention, both pay attention to images, to moments, to history, and to ideas. And it's sort of my version of journaling. And so this is a poem that I wrote years ago that ultimately ended up sort of giving birth to the book and gave me clarity about what book I was trying to write. And also when you're a poet writing nonfiction, sometimes you take the poems and you turn the stanzas into paragraphs and throw it at the end of your chapter and hope your editor doesn't notice. And so this is also an adaptation from the end of the Blandford chapter. Growing up, the iconography of the Confederacy was an ever-present fixture of my daily life. Every day on the way to school, I passed a statue of P.G.T. Beauregard riding on horseback, his Confederate uniform slung over his shoulder, and his military cap pulled far down over his eyes. As a child, I did not know who P.G.T. Beauregard was. I did not know he was the man who ordered the first attack that opened the Civil War. I did not know he was one of the architects who designed the Confederate battle flag. I did not know he led an army predicated on maintaining the institution of slavery. What I knew is that he looked like so many of the other statues that ornamented the edges of this city, these copper garlands of a past that saw truth as something that should be buried underground and silenced by the soil. After the war, the sons and daughters of the Confederacy reshaped the contours of treason into something they could name as honorable. We called it the lost cause, and it crept its way into textbooks that attempted to cover up a crime that was still unfolding. They told us that Robert E. Lee was an honorable man, guilty of nothing but fighting for the state and the people that he loved, that the Southern flag was about heritage and remembering those slain fighting to preserve their way of life. But see, the thing about the lost cause is that it's only lost if you're not actually looking. The thing about heritage is that it's a word that also means I'm ignoring what we did to you. I was taught the Civil War wasn't about slavery, but I was never taught how the declarations of Confederate secession had the promise of human bondage carved into its stone. I was taught the war was about economics, but I was never taught that in 1860 the 4 million enslaved black people were worth more than every bank, factory, and railroad combined. I was taught the Civil War was about states' rights, but I was never taught how the Fugitive Slave Act could care less about a border and spell Georgia and Massachusetts the exact same way. It's easy to look at a flag and call it heritage when you don't see the black bodies buried behind it. It's easy to look at a statue and call it history when you ignore the laws written in its wake. I come from a city abounding with statues of white men on pedestals and black children playing beneath them, where we played trumpets and trombones to drown out the Dixie song that still whistled in the wind. In New Orleans, there are over 100 schools, roads, and buildings named for Confederates and slaveholders. Every day, black children walk into buildings named after people who never wanted them to be there. Every time I would return home, I would drive on streets named for those who would have wanted me in chains, go straight for 2 miles on Robert E. Lee, take a left on Jefferson Davis, make the first right on Claiborne. Translation, go straight for 2 miles on the general who slaughtered hundreds of black soldiers who were trying to surrender, take a left on the president of the Confederacy who made the torture of black bodies the cornerstone of his new nation, make the first right on the man who permitted the heads of rebelling slaves to be put on stakes and spread across the city in order to prevent the others from getting any ideas. What name is there for this sort of violence? What do you call it when the road you walk on is named for those who imagined you under the noose? What do you call it when the roof over your head is named after people who would have wanted the bricks to crush you? Testing.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
So I will thank you for that, Clint. It's amazing, as many of your readings that I've seen online. I will readily admit I haven't gone through a chapter of a book like this, each chapter of a book like this, as, you know, the last I remember is Carol Anderson and reading White Rage and feeling like, again and again and again, and really getting a sense of that. In your book, it just had that same kind of emotional thrust and reality behind it. And so you talked about the origin story for the book. I want to go back a little bit. In your introduction to your YouTube channel, Crash Course on Black American History, you describe how you, growing up, didn't have the language or the toolkit to, you know, understand these issues here, right? I'm curious about that origin story. When did that happen? When did you find yourself interested and really coming to that language?
Yeah, and, testing. In so many ways, that's the original origin story of the book. I mean, I was talking to somebody about this the other day, and for me, if you're going to I spent 4 years writing this book. And if you're going to spend 4 years on something, I think it was somebody had asked me a question about audience and who was this book written for. And in so many ways, this book is written for a 15-year-old version of me, right? It's written for 15, 16-year-old Clint who grew up surrounded by this Confederate iconography and felt like I didn't have the language with which to understand why this black city had a leader of the Confederacy on a 60-foot tall statue in the middle of this traffic circle, and not even fully understanding truly like what the Confederacy was. And it wasn't until my adulthood that I, read the Declarations of Confederate Secession and see that in 1861, a state like Mississippi says, our position is thoroughly aligned with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. And so they're not vague about why they're seceding from the Union. They're quite clear about it from the beginning, as are all the other states. And getting, I think, just encountering all of this information that provided context and clarity and gave me a sense of understanding about American history and about why my city looked the way that it did. Because I grew up in a city that people would be like, New Orleans is the murder capital of the nation. We incarcerate more people per capita than China, Iran, and Russia. People talk about the cultural decay of the public housing projects and how it represented the sort of moral depredation of America, and implicit within so much of that, sometimes explicit, but sometimes implicit, was all of the things people were saying was wrong with Black America or wrong with Black people. And I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know how to say it was wrong. And so when I was a kid, I felt this sort of emotional and psychological paralysis because I knew that what I was hearing wasn't right, but I didn't know how to say it wasn't right. And I think the most insidious version of that is then what happens is that you begin to internalize some of the things that the world starts to tell you about yourself. And I think the power, for me, of learning more about American history is that this country can't lie to you anymore about why it looks the way that it does, that you can look around and you see the reason one community looks one way and another community looks another way. It's not because of the people in those communities, but it is because of what has been done to those communities generation after generation after generation. And it's so intuitive when you learn it, but I think we take for granted what it does to adults, but also to young people. I mean, it was really crippling. And as a high school educator, I saw it in my students. I saw it in my students who, I remember a moment when we had a student at my school who got killed in a drive-by. And one of my students, the students came back the next day and everybody it was really, there was so much despair and everybody was really despondent. And one of my students, when we were talking about it, he was just like, this is just how it is here, Mr. Smith. Like, this is just what happens. This is just what people do. And there was this sense of inevitability in the way that he understood how poverty and violence were so saturated within his community and then blamed it on his community, right? And blamed it on himself and blamed it on the people there without accounting for the history of public policy decisions that made it so that this community is saturated with violence and poverty in the first place. Like, that doesn't just happen. That is the result of decades of decisions that people in power have made to make it so that certain communities have been afforded opportunities and resources and certain types of capital and other communities have not. So it's a long way of saying this book was the process of attempting to fill in a lot of gaps that existed when I was a kid. And even if nobody else had read it, I think that's what made it a really generative project, is because I left this book feeling even more so like I had a level of clarity about why our country is the way that it is.
Yeah. That's one facet of it that I found striking is how teachable it is across levels too. I mean, I can see this in a high school classroom, but certainly undergraduate and graduate as well. It fills a lacuna in that way, right? Of thinking about these issues through these site-specific moments. As you're talking about that, I'm thinking myself of what struck me early on in Monticello, and you speaking about family separations, and the reason is I caught on to that in your poetry as well, and really thinking about the way that you deal with families in really kind of brilliantly poetic ways. I want to add too, like you have one poem in particular where the enjambment just leaves you waiting for family to drop, and when it comes there, it's the realization of what's at stake again. And I think I taught on the U.S.-Mexico border, and the family separations were obviously vividly real for us there. I was there when the camps began to open and when they were separating children from their families, and I don't think I ever really let myself process how traumatizing that was for my students and certainly for me. I remember going into airports the airport there, and to go and give various talks and whatnot. And more, I would see groups of young children who were clearly being relocated. You know, they often were wearing navy blue khakis, you know, knockoff Vans and plainclothes, you know, government officials were escorting them. And it was just a moment for me of paralysis. I felt like I looked around and I was like, why aren't we, like, why aren't we doing something? I felt guilty about not saying anything, about not speaking up. So it's a long way to say. I mean, it is something that is, you mentioned insidious, right? I feel like it was nefarious then. I mean, it was deliberate. It was a way to send a particular message and exert certainly a certain sense of control. So we're looking at this, you know, in 2017, 2018, and it's transpiring on a magnified level. I'm wondering how you are in the process of writing this book and seeing probably what I'm seeing too in terms of the escalation of that blatant racism. Like, how is your thought process then going to these sites, kind of thinking about that atmosphere?
Yeah, I mean, I think throughout the process of this book, I thought a lot about the framing of the scholar Saidiya Hartman, who talks about the afterlife of slavery and how the history of slavery continues to shape our social, political, and economic infrastructure in profound ways. And so, you know, a really fascinating moment to your point at Monticello is when Donna and Grace for themselves, in that moment when David is talking about family separation, I think it was Grace who had a moment where she was like, and it's still happening, right? She was like, this is still something that's happening right now, because this was at the height of media coverage around the family separations in the Trump administration. And, you know, I think that there's so many moments throughout the book in which we see the parallels of the past to what's happening now, right? So even at Angola, I talked about Angola, you know, I don't think that, I'm not someone who would say that mass incarceration is the same as slavery. I think they are two distinct phenomenological entities, and both are horrific and both are cruel, but we can interrogate them on their own respective accords without saying that one is the other. And I know people who will say prison is slavery, and I understand that and I'm sympathetic to that, but I also think that we should be precise in the way that we describe certain atrocities and not sort of lump them all together. So, you know, prison is, or in slavery, if your mother is enslaved and then you are an enslaved person, right? That is how the Virginia colonies in the early 17th century created partis sequitur ventrum specifically for that purpose. And so you are inherently born into a different caste status, which is different than something that happens in prison. Obviously, there's a lot of sociological research on the relationship between your likelihood of going to prison if your parent is incarcerated, but if your parent is incarcerated, you are not inherently incarcerated. And so I think that's different. So I say all that because I think it's important for us to both be cognizant of the parallels, but also not to say that something is something, right? So family separation at the border is undoubtedly, unsettlingly analogous to separations that have happened in chattel slavery and separations that have happened to families in other oppressive conditions. But I think at the same time, we should be precise in saying this is reminiscent of that, but there are also specifically insidious things about what we see happening with family separation that's different than what happened in chattel slavery. And then what happened with chattel slavery is different and has a different set of social and historical context than what we see happening now. So I think I'm always trying to just be as precise as possible and find that balance of, because what you don't want is for your larger point or argument to be undermined by people saying you're being hyperbolic, or by people saying that you are just being imprecise. And so I think even for those of us who care deeply about advocacy and social causes and making sure that people are cognizant of the horror that we see in the different facets of our social life, I think it's also important for us to be clear about what something is and what something isn't, so that our point is not undermined in an effort to bring attention to whatever thing we're discussing.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that quite a bit. I think in my own efforts to think through, possible avenues for Black and Brown solidarity, right? It is I mean, absolutely necessary to be careful not to conflate those experiences, right? But John Marquez writes, that they have experiences of expendability and exploitability for Black and Brown, but they are distinctly different histories, right? And I think that's absolutely critical. And I think also, when we think about the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, I think for a lot of us, that was a moment where a lot of virtue signaling, as I'm sure you saw everywhere. But as people were writing statements, I think, that was one on the border where I not to air dirty laundry, right? But I had colleagues who wanted to insert, statements there about the family separations, about what's transpiring, and it was a moment where, it was very clear, thankfully many of us said this is a moment to step back, and really, we're not doing that. We are listening and we're thinking about this particular moment. And I'm curious then about that moment as well, because this has to be right in the thick of you researching this book. I mean, the world shifts. I mean, how do you negotiate that?
Yeah, so when George Floyd happened, I had just finished the first draft. And so I finished reporting the book about 2 weeks before everything shut down. So I'd taken a trip to New York at the end of February, and thought that my next trip would be out to California, because I had in mind a chapter about the relationship, the history of slavery in California and slavery in the gold mines. But COVID had other plans, and maybe, and I guess the universe was also saying, the book is done. You don't want this to be, because the book is about 300 pages, and there are a lot of remarkable books that I love that are like 900 pages. But it also took me like a few years to pull it off the bookshelf. So like I just finished the biography of Ulysses S. Grant by Ron Chernow, which is like an extraordinary, incredible biography, amazing book. I've had that book on my shelf for a few years, and every time I was going to the next book, I was like, no, not that one. Let me read the 200-page novel. So for me, I didn't want the book to be too intimidating, and so I think it was a moment where I had to realize, like as a physical artifact, I didn't want people to be frightened of it. Like I wanted to feel accessible to a 15-year-old. I wanted to feel accessible to somebody who has kids and has, so much other stuff to do. You're competing against so many other things in people's lives. And so, and in the specific context of George Floyd, I mean, we've had so many moments over the past several years that are further and perhaps like compounding reminders of how important it is to understand the historical and sociological context that animates contemporary life. And there's something about this sort of everything we saw after George Floyd and this level of how omnipresent and how widespread the response was, how so many universities and corporations and organizations embraced Black Lives Matter as a slogan, to varying degrees, as a sentiment, was just so striking, because I remember after Ferguson, and I remember after Baltimore, and I remember after the sort of early days of Black Lives Matter, how, those folks didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. And so what I think is true, I joke sometimes that if you would ask somebody in 2012, like, what's redlining, they would have been like, is that a type of makeup? Like, is that Rihanna's new like lipstick line? Like, what is redlining? What is that? And now more people understand it as the state-sponsored mechanism through which housing segregation was perpetuated by the federal government throughout the 20th century. And I think there is in our public consciousness, there is a more sophisticated understanding of how racism is not just an interpersonal phenomenon, but it is a systemic one, a structural one, a historical one. And I think we saw that in the media coverage around COVID, whereas I think, generally, I think it was pretty, in the mainstream media, it was pretty responsible relative to, I think, what it would have been 7, 8 years ago, a decade ago, in the sense that when we found out that Black and Latinx people and indigenous people were disproportionately being impacted by this disease, were disproportionately dying from this virus. I think there is a version of this that happens years ago in which there is an echo of how these communities are doing something wrong to be on the receiving end of such statistics, to make such statistics possible. And I think now you had more people, it was far from perfect, but you had more people and more voices who were saying, we cannot understand the reason that these communities are being disproportionately impacted without understanding the reason that so many of these communities live in intergenerational housing, without understanding how so many of these communities are working low-wage frontline jobs, without understanding how so many of these communities don't have cars and rely on public transportation, without understanding the history of medical discrimination and medical distrust, and all of these things that was so important in providing context as to why something was happening. And so I think that George Floyd and all of these moments have moved the public consciousness of different groups of people further along. But I think the other side of that is, part of what we see now with the critical race theory boogeyman thing is a direct backlash to a larger shift in public consciousness that has happened over the past several years. So part of what has happened is that you have millions more people who understand with more sophistication, with more nuance, with more texture, the various dynamics of how race and racism shape contemporary life, and also who are recalibrating their understanding of American history and of the larger American project. And for some people, that represents like an existential threat. That represents, and not only an existential threat, like a profound existential crisis, like a threat to who they understand they are in the world. And so the reason you see so many state legislatures across the country that are instituting these sometimes successful, sometimes not, bans on like what history you can and can't teach is a direct response, I think, to, it is very much part of a tradition of pushback to moments of racial progress, but in this context, I think is a direct response to the fact that more people are saying, actually, like this country, the story we tell about this country is more complicated than the story I've been told. And so when a group of people understand who they are in relation to a story that more people are realizing is a myth, and more people are realizing is like a very myopic way to think about the history of this country, then it is not only a threat to that history, it is a threat to them. It is a threat to their family, it is a threat to their community, it is a threat to their sense of self. And in the book, I think you see that most profoundly with the Blandford Cemetery, where, you know, for so many people, history is not about empirical evidence or primary source documents. It's a story that they've been told. And it's a story that they tell. It's an heirloom that's passed down across generations. It's something in which loyalty takes precedence over truth, because it's not about truth. It's about being able to tell yourself a certain story that allows you to situate yourself in the American narrative in a way that feels empowering. And so when people begin to tell a different story, people feel their power being taken away.
Now, have you received pushback yourself here? I mean, you would be a proverbial boogeyman along those lines.
Yeah, for the book?
Yeah.
Not to my face. And I think, you know, I took, part of what I've seen is that people will use one mistake or one straw man or one sort of bad faith something in, so if we're to talk specifically like the 1619 Project, and Nicole, I was part of the 1619 Project. Nicole Hannah-Jones, I admire so much as a friend. And so there's been so much pushback, I think in ways that can't be disentangled from the fact that Nicole is a Black woman, in ways that can't be disentangled from the fact that she presents herself in a way that is brewing with confidence, in ways that is, I think, unsettling for many people. But also she had one line, basically, in her essay that contended that the Revolutionary War, that part of the reason the Revolutionary War was fought was to preserve slavery from Britain, who was beginning to, you know, in the process of abolishing the institution. And, you know, that is the thing about that is that's a question of historical interpretation, right? It's not like a yes or no, that's what history is. History is a matter of like how do we think and make sense of this question? Because certainly what we know to be true is that even during the American Revolution, the British governor of Virginia said to enslaved people throughout Virginia, if you come fight for us, we'll free you, right? And like, you will no longer be enslaved. So there are all sorts of examples that lend credence to such an argument that slavery did play a role in shaping how the dynamics of the American Revolution. But I say all that because then that moment is used by some to sort of undermine the entire project. And so for me, I went to great lengths to make sure that everything in the book that was a matter of interpretation, I was presenting as a matter of interpretation rather than saying it is or it isn't. Like some historians contend that, and I think sometimes it's important to hedge. And so I think because I had watched what happened with the 1619 Project, I was perhaps even more careful than I would have been to make sure that there was not something that risked undermining the larger project. And there still might be. Like, I mean, somebody might, you never know. But at this point, I have not. Because part of what I want to do, and I think part of what the book does, is you're hearing from me, but you're mostly hearing from the public historians and from the docents and from the guides and the visitors. Like, those are the voices that I wanted to hear from. In so many ways, this book is an homage to those people who are at these historical sites, telling these stories, sharing this history, and again, sharing this history with people who might not pick up my book, who might not pick up a book by Walter Johnson or Annette Gordon-Reed or Leslie Harris or David Blight or any of these folks who might be going, as Nia Bates in the Monticello chapter talks about, like, some of these people who go to Monticello are coming from like a wine brewery, right, and or a winery, or coming from, on their way back from vacation, and they stop there. And so you are getting people to potentially encounter information when they don't even necessarily know that they're looking for it. And I think that that's like a really special and unique position to be in.
That's brilliant. Yeah, absolutely. I'm tempted to be selfish here, right, and continue in this, but I know I need to open this up for questions from the audience, so maybe this is a good time to transition there. Okay.
Excellent handwriting.
Okay. I'm sorry if I did read this incorrectly. Should have brought my reading glasses too. Okay, thank you for your time and work in the latest book. I've been thinking a lot about your idea on, and now I'm stuck here, right? Of stories shaping policy, and it relates to my dissertation work. So here, let me get to the question here, right? What and where you think the place of the story is in order to make right or amend wrongs? I think of the work of Sylvia Wynter and Saidiya Hartman, and wonder what or if the place of the story is, in your opinion, in the transformation of the future.
I think that so much of the human experience is built on stories. I mean, it is, we tell ourselves all sorts of stories that serve as the foundation of our relationships, that serve as the foundation of, the reasons that we do the work that we do. We tell stories about the sort of life that we want to live, the sort of legacy we want to have. And so, I think stories can take on both positive and negative connotations, and I think can take on both positive and negative lives in and of themselves. Like the story that I that shapes the way that I think about my existence in many ways is something I kind of figured out as I was writing the book, which is slavery existed in this country for 250 years. First enslaved people, if we're to think about the beginning of slavery in the American British colonies, 1619, and then ending in 1865 with the end of the Civil War and the 13th Amendment. What is true is that from the moment black people arrived on these shores, they were fighting for freedom. What that also means is that for the vast majority of enslaved people fighting for freedom, they never got a chance to see and experience the freedom they were fighting for because it didn't end until 250 years later. But that doesn't mean that what they were fighting for didn't matter. That doesn't mean that what they were fighting for was for naught. Because part of it is recognizing that we're all sort of chipping away at this proverbial wall. And we don't know if this wall is 6 inches thick, we don't know if it's 6 miles thick. But we know that the more that we chip away at it, the less the people who come after us will have to chip away at. And what responsibility does it bestow on me to sort of attempt to build the sort of world that I want to live in, even if I might not be able to experience it myself, because that's what people did for me, right? I come from a generation of people who fought for something they knew they might never see themselves, but they fought for it anyway because they knew that someday someone would, and that someone wouldn't even be their children or their grandchildren. It would be some people they never met. And so when I think about building a better world, when I think about building a more just world, when I think about the sort of society I want to live in, I think it's also important for me to recognize that sometimes you don't get to experience the fruit of your own labor. But that doesn't mean that work isn't important, because what that work is doing is laying the groundwork for the lives of people who you will never meet. But that's also the same thing that was done for us. We're only able to have this conversation because of people who have done tireless work on our behalf, even when they didn't know who we were. And I think that that's part of the black tradition, but that's also part of the human tradition. I mean, that's what it means to be human. It means to try to build the sort of world you want to live in, even if you won't get to see it yourself. And so that is the story. That is a story that is important to me, and that very much has come to shape how I move through the world.
All right, here's another one. Thank you for being here and sharing your work and passions with us. What has been one frustration on your journey in this work, and how did you continue forward to completion?
One frustration. I mean, a frustration is just having to finish the book. I mean, you know, it's, I could have, it was just such a generative and like intellectually and creatively rich project. I mean, I was just telling somebody, I feel like I became such a better writer over the course of writing this book. It's interesting because the narrative of the book now, like I read the reviews and stuff, and people are like, poet and journalist, Clint Smith, da-da-da-da-da. And I'm like, who's a journalist? Like, who's that? Like, I never, it's interesting because I'm a staff writer for The Atlantic now, but I've only been in that job for a year and some change. I was a graduate student who should have been writing my dissertation, but is instead writing a book, which I don't recommend doing both at the same time. It got done, but I wouldn't do it again. But I did not think of myself as a journalist, even when I can now look back and realize that what I was doing was journalism. I was reporting. I was like going up to people and asking them questions and trying to get them to tell me their stories. But it was so invigorating. And I just was learning so much, both as a writer, both as a historian, as a, and as someone who liked to visit these places. I mean, if it were up to me and my family would go visit Civil War battlefields every other weekend. My wife has a different idea of fun, and that's fine. But like, it's all about balance.
That's right.
And I think that I would have, at some point you have to end the book. But I could have kept doing this research for a long, I mean, there's like I probably won't, but like there's a version of the universe in which I do like How the Word is Passed Part 2, because there's so many places that I went or that I wanted to go that I didn't get a chance to go that I wanted to write about. But yeah, I mean, the most frustrating part was not having enough time to go to all the places that I wanted to go. And part of that was that I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old who, when the book began, the 2-year-old didn't exist, and the 4-year-old had just been born. And so they were both, part of it is like, wanting to be a responsible co-parent, and like, so a lot of it was like flying in someplace, doing as much as I could, and flying back, driving someplace and driving back the same day. And so it made it tough, but it was also a nice sort of respite, because like I go and spend the day at this plantation, and then I come home and I have to pretend to be a brachiosaurus. And so it's like, they kind of, you don't get to really wallow in the sorrow of the day. It's like, are you gonna be a Parasaurolophus or not? Like, what are you doing? Like, come on. Man, I learned so much about dinosaurs over quarantine. It's just, there's so many. There's so many.
Yeah, right. No, that's why I just read the review by Drew Faust on your work, and I mean I think she gets it right in thinking about how your voice as a poet, I mean, really kind of drives that. It's fantastic. Somebody keep me honest too in terms of time. I don't want to go over, and we're okay. Okay. All right. So here's the next one, and I'm sorry as I'm reading this again. I'm trying to decipher this. I will say, if it makes anyone feel better, that my penmanship is awful. So you'd be in the same position here. So I'm such a fan of your work. Thank you for your time today. Given the often grim reality that your work reveals, how do you, I guess, toe the line of authority, or hope that this work and these stories will help create actionable change?
It's a good question. I think the thing as a writer and as an artist is that it's not up to me, right? Like, I mean, I think I have to, and I learned this pretty early, is that I have to let go of the idea that the book will change people's minds or change people's actions or beliefs, because that's not something that's in my control. All I can do is provide people with information, is provide people with stories, it provide people with hopefully an entry point to thinking differently about something than they may have thought about it before. But in terms of what they do with that, it's not up to me. And I think that if you predicate the success of your book and your work, for me, and other writers might feel differently, but for me, if I predicate or tie the success of my work to whether or not it changes people, I mean, that's just it's such an abstract and amorphous thing. Like, what is change them in what way? Like, change them how much, and it also kind of feels like you're chasing dust. Like, I'm not sure what that looks like. I'm certainly moved and deeply appreciate when people are changed by it. It doesn't mean that I don't want people to be changed by it or that I don't care. It's just that I can't tether my sense of whether the book is doing what it's supposed to do by whether it brings someone to action. Like, again, like, it's not guaranteed that anybody will read your book. And so even at a base level, like, if I'm gonna spend years working on something, it has to be because I find it interesting, or that it's intellectually and creatively generative for me. But yeah, something that has happened that's really fascinating is that I got an email letting me know that everyone on the board on Angola Prison's board has been assigned to read the book, which was really fascinating. And then somebody told me that they are now sort of changing and redesigning and reimagining the museum. So I can't say that that's because of the book. I hope the book was one thing that contributed to, I'm sure, the folks who are incarcerated there and who are formerly incarcerated at Angola have been talking about this for a long time. But if the book was able to be helpful in any way to that, then stuff like that is an enormous honor.
I respect your humility, but you know that you're wrong. I mean, that's great. I am thinking here, just to kind of dovetail on that question, though, you have not been in the classroom since the publication of this book, have you? Have you returned to teaching? How do you see that? Is there a shift in your thinking? Yeah.
I mean, so I was a high school English teacher before I started graduate school. Is there a high school English teacher in the crowd? Hey, we're the best. And, oh man, I miss it every day. I think that, like, talking to teenagers about novels is just like the most fun, the coolest thing in the world. I just love it so much. I didn't love waking up at 5:30 in the morning, but I just, that every day we would just like sit in a circle and like talk about Song of Solomon or like Julius Caesar, it was great. More recently, I've been teaching in prisons and jails, and so I was teaching at DC jail, but have not been in since the pandemic. And yeah, I'm curious what my students would think about it. And it's been so long since I've taught. In some ways, I guess I do a more public sort of teaching in some ways now, but teaching is and has always been, like, teaching and writing for me are kind of go hand in hand, right? Like I learn so much from the act of teaching, and like am regularly, moved and so fascinated and compelled by how much I learn from the readings that my students have of different texts that I hadn't previously considered. So it'll be super fascinating to see what that looked like in the context of my own text. I mean, one of the most interesting things, one of the things that I missed about not being able to be on book tour, physical book tour, is that, when you're doing a webinar, people don't talk back to you. People don't talk back to you. So I haven't really gotten a sense of how, other than emails people send or tweets and stuff, but I just love hearing how people, like what sections are moving to people or what it made them think about. And I love that with the poetry. I love that with the nonfiction. I mean, one of the things I love about the poems when I would go sort of talk to different, especially like high school and college students, is that, you can have a class of 30 students who read the same poem and read it in 30 different ways. And I think that's the amazing thing about literature. That's the amazing thing about art, is that you can have 1,000 people look at this painting and see 1,000 different things. And so when people, students will ask me, what did you mean in this line? Or what did you mean in this poem? Or what did you mean when you said that? It's like, that's much less interesting to me than what you read when you saw it. I think all the time about the writer Alfred Lord Tennyson in his poem Ulysses, and in it he has a line where he says, I am a part of all that I have met. And like, that is what we bring to art. That is what we bring to literature. That is what we bring to anything, any film or anything that we experience. Like, the way we experience it is inextricably linked to every conversation we have ever had, every person we have ever met, every book we have ever read. And those shape the way that we see and make sense of that artistic artifact. And that's so fascinating and like so cool to me. And so hopefully, as fingers crossed, Delta goes away, the world continues to open back up, as I do more in-person stuff, just getting to hear, what struck people, what was interesting to people. Even, I'm for the first time, I'm listening to my audiobook. I didn't listen, the book's been out for almost 5 months now, and people were like, have you listened to your book? And I was like, listen to my voice for 10 hours? No. But I decided to do, I was like, what does this sound? And it's funny, because I'm like, I guess 5 months is like enough distance to be reminded of certain sections. Like, I forgot I wrote that. Oh, that's fascinating. Who knew? Who knew? And you're like, oh, you wrote. But I guess it's like watching a movie multiple times. Like, you see something different each time. So it's kind of cool to be able to like experience my book in this way and re-encounter information I had forgotten about.
One more, okay, we've got time for one more here. So when parallels of the past come up, one thing that stands out is Minstrels of Virginia, and how white people will put on blackface and perform the cakewalk, something slaves would do on the plantation for their entertainment, and make money off this minstrel show. In today's society, white people certainly appropriate cultures such as wearing box braids or putting on Native American costumes during Halloween. How can we teach cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation? How is technology beneficial in holding people accountable?
I think that it's tricky, right? Because the line is not often clear. But I think that it is important. Part of this is that it depends on each person's disposition and sensibility. So I answer this by saying I am not telling people how they should or should not react to things they find offensive. I think that's up to each person. I will say for me, part of what I try to remember is that there is a difference between a mistake and then an act that is meant to cause offense. And I think for me, it is important to distinguish between the two so that I can know whether it's important to shame someone for something that they are doing if they are attempting to be intentionally provocative and offensive, or whether it's a context in which I need to pull someone aside or, like, proverbially pull someone in for a conversation that is going to ultimately be more generative for the thing that I'm concerned about. Because the thing is, I think social media is both great because, to the point of the question, I think more people, you can hold more people accountable. And there is more accountability on this stuff than there ever has been before. And I think that is definitely tied to the progress we have made in having a more, in some quarters, sophisticated discourse around some of this stuff. I also think that sometimes it is very easy to, like, dunk on people who aren't fully cognizant of the way that their act is causing harm. And so it's tricky because it depends on the context, it depends on the moment, it depends on what's happening. I think that in my best moments, I try to remember that when I have said something or done something that might have been harmful or offensive to a group of people in ways I didn't intend for it to be, that there have been people, sometimes friends, sometimes strangers, who have extended an enormous amount of grace and generosity to me. And I try my best to extend that same grace and generosity to others when it is clear that they are not cognizant of the way that the thing that they are doing is causing harm to people. So I think we just, in every individual act and every specific instance, people have to make a decision about what they think is happening. And also have to, specifically if you're a BIPOC person, or a person of any oppressed group who is experiencing this harm, you also have to figure out your own emotional bandwidth in order to even decide whether or not you want to deal with that. Because maybe you don't want to deal with that, and it's not your responsibility to then have to teach that person about what they did was wrong. You can make that decision, but you also don't have to. And so, it's a lot of, like, if this, if that, but I think it's a complicated, nuanced thing. And it just is important, I think, again, to bring it back to the public historians and docents and guides that I met. Part of what I loved about what they did was that they extended this grace and generosity, and that, like, no matter who showed up and no matter what they thought when they arrived at that plantation or in that place, they did not judge them for what they did or didn't know. But when they presented them with that information, there was a level of accountability and responsibility to say, you might not have known, and that's okay, but now you know, and you can't run from that. You have to sit with that. And I think it's a model for me, and I think for a model for so many of us.
Clint, thank you so much for being here. Yes. Do know that our Dean, Jeffrey Cohen, is brilliant, and he's going to try to make you stay at ASU, and I hope he succeeds here. But thanks again for joining us, and thank you all for coming out tonight.
Thank you all so much.